Now I'm very pleased to introduce Peter Hessler. Peter Hessler first moved to China as a member of the Peace Corps in 1996, serving for 2 years as an English teacher in a teacher's college, an experience he chronicled in his first book, Rivertown. He remained in China after his term in the Peace Corps was up, working as a freelance journalist for publications including the Boston Globe, National Geographic, and the Wall Street Journal. In 2000, he became a staff writer for The New Yorker and served as that magazine's Beijing correspondent until 2007. And he continues to work write for The New Yorker and for National Geographic. His second book, Oracle Bones, was a series of journalistic essays on life in China and was a finalist for the National Book Award in 2006. His most recent book, Country Driving, focuses on the growing automobile culture in China and begins with his experience of receiving his Chinese driver's license and driving across the country following the Great Wall. The Boston Globe writes of the book, "Full of exotic detail, solid reporting, and ironic observation, Country Driving offers a personal snapshot of the world's second superpower hurtling through the 21st century." And the Washington Post called it a wonderful book about China that also happens to be a terrific book about the human race.
Yeah, thanks for everybody for coming here this evening. I'm going to read some sections and describe some of the things from this book. I'm also going to show some photos and illustrations. I'm not a professional photographer, but I do usually travel with the camera, basically for reference, because I've often found it useful when I go back and write about things to see how they looked. But I also want to give you a sense of some of the things I'm describing, so I'll be showing those on the screen here. And I'd like to start just by reading a couple of the paragraphs from the beginning of the book. There are still empty roads in China, especially on the western steppes, where the highways to the Himalayas carry little traffic other than dust and wind. Even the boom towns of the coast have their share of vacant streets. They lead to half-built factory districts and planned apartment complexes. They wind through terraced fields that are destined to become the suburbs of tomorrow. They connect villages whose residents traveled by foot less than a generation ago. It was the thought of all that fleeting open space, the new roads to old places, the landscapes on the verge of change, that finally inspired me to get a Chinese driver's license. By the summer of 2001, when I applied to the Beijing Public Safety Traffic Bureau, I had lived in China for 5 years. During that time, I had traveled passively by bus and plane, boat and train. I dozed across provinces and slept through towns. But sitting behind the wheel woke me up. That was happening everywhere. In Beijing alone, almost 1,000 new drivers register on the average each day, the pioneers of a nationwide auto boom. Most of them came from the growing middle class, for whom a car represented mobility, prosperity, modernity. For me, it meant adventure. The questions of the written driver's exam suggested a world where nothing could be taken for granted. When I signed up to get a license, they gave me a test book with sample questions. 223, if you come to a road that has been flooded, you should A, accelerate so the motor doesn't flood. B, stop, examine the water to make sure it's shallow, and then drive across slowly. Or C, find a pedestrian and make him cross ahead of you. Or there was 228. When approaching a railroad crossing, you should A, accelerate and cross. B, accelerate only if you see a train approaching. Or C, slow down and make sure it's safe before crossing. Accelerate was almost always one of the options on the questions. At any rate, I passed the test and got my license. And soon after I did that, I had this idea that I wanted to take a road trip across China. And National Geographic magazine had been asking me to do a story about the Great Wall. And this is something that's been written about in so many different ways, but I like the idea of somehow tying it into a road trip. And so I thought, well, why not drive across China through the regions that have Great Wall fortifications and write about it and see what life is like on the road. So I started looking into whether this was possible or not, and I talked to a friend who was a driver at the Wall Street Journal Bureau in Beijing, and I asked him, well, what do you do about maps? And he said, well, get this book, and it was published by a company called Sino Maps, and it was the Chinese automobile driver's book of maps. I hadn't really spent much time looking carefully at Chinese maps before this time, but I got this book, and it had about 250 pages, and each page was a different section of China. sometimes part of a province or sometimes the whole thing. There was actually there was an entire page for Taiwan and all the roads in Taiwan, although of course nobody in mainland China was going to be driving there. But any book in China that has a map of China has to include Taiwan for political reasons. And when I was looking at this, it was a little overwhelming because one of the first things I noticed is that there was no scale. Each map was different just depending on the size of the province that it was covering. So there was no consistency, and the bottom of it never had a printed scale. I tried to find something more detailed, and then I realized that actually topographical maps are not available in China for public consumption. They're classified. They're considered sort of a secret, state secret. So there's sort of an element of calculated vagueness to most things that you would buy. The other, so sometimes they would have the distances between towns that were labeled. Sometimes they wouldn't. It was inconsistent. Most roads were also not labeled. You can see sort of the thick ones would have a number on them, but all these little roads were not labeled. My idea was I wanted to take the smaller roads and to stick to sort of the back roads of China and see what it was like to drive there. So I asked my friend, well, I'm looking at all these little red capillaries across the page, and how do you know what road you're on? What are the names for roads like that? And he said, oh, they don't name roads like that. And I said, well, so how do you figure out where you're going? He said, well, sometimes they have a sign that will give you the name of the next destination, but otherwise you can just pull over and ask somebody, which had also been covered on the examination in 352. If another motorist stops to ask directions, you should A, not tell him, B, reply patiently and accurately, or C, tell him the wrong way. At any rate, I figured that I would just sort of make it up as I go along, and that was the plan. And I rented a Jeep Cherokee from a rental agency in Beijing. This is a Chinese-made Jeep Cherokee, and one of the first things I realized about this car, actually you can kind of tell from the picture, is that it doesn't have four-wheel drive. That was when I was stuck in sand somewhere, and they had sort of changed the car to make it a little cheaper and more appropriate to the Chinese market, and they'd taken out the all-wheel drive. One thing I quickly realized from the maps is that you never knew exactly what kind of road you would be on. China was in the midst of building roads, but it was unpredictable, and sometimes the surface would be excellent, and sometimes you could end up on sand like that. I spent a fair amount of time getting stuck. That was stuck in snow. And in China, this sort of thing was pretty easy. You just find somebody to come and help pull you out. It turned out that this was sort of one of the first big years of China's auto boom. The year that I started driving, the number of new Beijing licenses that had been issued increased by more than 50% over the previous year. And at that time, China had about 44 million licensed drivers. By last year, that number had risen to 138 million. That's almost 100 million new drivers in the span of 8 years. And of those about 140 million today drivers, 35% have been driving for less than 3 years. And it's sort of an underlying theme of this book, which begins with this car journey, but also goes on to look at other aspects of life in China. But there is an amazing sense of people figuring out new things in this country. Nobody is doing something that's really totally familiar to them. Everybody has to learn. You're figuring out on the fly. I was lost on the roads in China, and I soon realized that many other people were in the same situation, both literally and metaphorically. Of course, that also means that there's some risk to this. The year that I started driving, China had only 20% of the cars and buses as the United States, but 200% of the fatalities. It's natural in a place where people are learning to drive for the first time. Sometimes you'd see signs like this one that I saw in Western China. It says 40 kilometers an hour is the safest. 80 kilometers an hour is dangerous. 100 kilometers an hour and you're going to the hospital. I like that the Chinese road propaganda is great. I mean, I spent a lot of time taking pictures because it was very, very direct and very blunt. They didn't mince words. This was one in Qinghai. Sometimes it's really quite beautiful. I thought this was basically like art. And they had taken a sedan and posted above the road, and it says, "Cherish life, drive safely." And then they have a car with little drops of blood painted on it to get the message across. This was another one I saw, which was even more literal. This was a car that had been wrecked, and on the back it says 4 people died inside. despite the challenges of driving, I found it to be sort of remarkably peaceful. Because once you're out of the cities in China, and especially at this time, there were very few people out on the road. It was driving a car was new for people, and they often weren't comfortable taking long road trips. And in many places, you had the roads to yourself. It was also surprising how many roads at this time were being built and were really of high quality. I think many people go to China now are sort of shocked by that. And it can be sort of stunning after American infrastructure looks pretty ragged after you've been in China for a while, especially at this time, because they've built an enormous expressway system, and those roads are, they've only been functioning for 10 years or less, and there isn't the sort of wear that you see in the U.S. It was very common for me to be on a road like this, quite beautiful, and with very little traffic. That was in Inner Mongolia. And sometimes I'd be on a dirt track like that as well. The landscapes in northern China and the west of China are really stunningly beautiful, and that was another reason why I wanted to drive in this area. I went across the Gobi Desert and across the Tengger Desert and through mountain ranges, and it's really something that, again, our image of China as this relentlessly urban place is really not that accurate, especially in the north and in the west. I didn't really plan the trip. I would figure it out day to day. Which would give me time also if I found something interesting or talked to somebody that I wanted to spend more time with. I could always stop. I brought a tent, and I camp most nights just beside the road, found a turn-off and would pitch my tent. One of the reasons I did that was because when I did this trip, it wasn't legal as a journalist to do something like this. I mean, first of all, the rental company had a rule that I couldn't take the car out of Beijing, which I decided was sort of an optional rule. It's, again, sort of like how you do things in China, that you kind of do it. People say, it's better to ask forgiveness than permission, and that was my strategy with the rental company. I did this trip in two parts, and after the first part, I came back with this car, and I was very unsure of how they were going to respond to this odometer, which had some insane, I think it was 4,000 new miles on it, and it was too shameless to say that I had stayed in Beijing for the entire 4,000 miles of that. And the guy at the rental agent said, "Where did you go?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I went actually out of Beijing, and I went to Inner Mongolia." And he said, "Inner Mongolia?" And I said, "Yeah." And I went to Shanxi, and he said, "Did you know you're not supposed to take it out of Beijing?" I said, "Yeah, but I drove very carefully. I thought it'd be." And he said, and he was just thrilled. I mean, he couldn't have been happy. He called everybody in the office. Look at, the foreigner went all the way to Inner Mongolia. And often in China, things are like that. People are sort of amazingly flexible. And I learned the rental guys, I mean, I really, over basically an 8-year period of renting from them, I don't think I could have done much worse to cars than I did there, including one time returning a car without a bumper. And Mr. Wong, who worked at the rental company, everything was taken in stride. He never, nothing ever fazed him. And it is one of the things of being in China today is that everybody is learning things and encountering new things, but it also means that they have to be sort of flexible and pragmatic and in many ways good-natured. And it's something that makes the place very livable as a foreigner and reduces some of the stress. But I was also concerned about police because the Chinese are always wary of journalists, and in some of these areas there's ethnic minorities and maybe something's happened. And if you show up as a journalist and you're staying in a Chinese city and you register in a hotel, all foreigners have to show their passport, and a journalist has a passport that says that he's a journalist. It's a type of visa that you get. And so I didn't, and when they register at the hotel, they're supposed to give those lists to the police. And sometimes I'd had trouble with this. You check into a hotel and 30 minutes later you get a knock on the door. So that was the reason for bringing the tent. I also had no idea what to expect on the road. And I grew up in Missouri and drove a lot as a kid. And one thing, in the States, it's sort of funny. I mean, it's one of the few places, if you're like a middle-class American, where you do think about the police, basically, is when you're on the road. And I learned in China that wasn't at all the case. In fact, I almost never saw cops except for guys like this. This was in Inner Mongolia, and there was really, all of this was so new, there wasn't a functioning highway patrol in China, and so you wouldn't see cars out there patrolling. Occasionally around a city you would see cops going from one place to another. They always ran the lights, just apparently for fun, or maybe they'd seen it on TV and wonder. And they always drove incredibly slowly, and it was the weirdest thing, because the first time I saw it, I was driving behind the cop, and he's got his lights going, and just sort of looking around, but then people just start whipping by him. Everybody's passing him, and you know, I realize, okay, well, he doesn't care. He's going out to lunch with his buddies. He just has the lights going, and you got to pass him like everybody else. And I, you know, I can't count the number of times I passed a cop in China with his lights on. It just got to be normal. But this was my favorite thing in Inner Mongolia. Their strategy for Drive Safe was to put statues of cops on the road. And they had these guys all over the place. They even had ID numbers on their chests, and you'd see them at places like this. Was in Hohhot, the capital of Inner Mongolia, and a friend of mine recently sent me this, which is sort of a new innovation, which is actually an inflatable cop. He's carrying a sign that says "Slow down," and my friend wanted to buy this for me because they have police stores where you can get almost any kind of police gear you want, including the lights. And but this was actually about $585. So it was because it has a huge fan in the bottom to keep the thing inflated. But I actually have two of my sisters are married to cops, one in Minnesota and one in Missouri, and I would always send them pictures of these guys after I saw them on the highway and this guy and say, you know, they're making him cheaper in China. And it's only a matter of time before your job gets outsourced. So I was sort of surprised in a sense by how easy it was, and there were moments of real sort of peacefulness on the road in China, combined with moments of sheer terror. The other thing that I hadn't really thought about beforehand was people along the road, and there were a lot of hitchhikers. And not having driven in China, I hadn't thought about this. And there wasn't a lot of guidance. They had one question on the driving exam. If you give somebody a ride and realize that he left something in your car, you should A, keep it for yourself, B, return to the person or his place at work as quickly as possible, or C, call him and offer to return it for a reward. And when I would find people trying to flag down rides in China. When you do this is the gesture that you make, and you would see them beside the road in really remote places, all over the north, because I was on these small roads. It wasn't so common to find a farmer doing this, which would have been my first guess, that these would be local farmers going to and from places. But they would depend on more regular transport. They weren't going to wait out on the road. And it tended to be a certain type of person, and I'll read from a description of that. Most people I picked up were women who looked almost as out of place as I did. They tended to be of a distinct type. They were small-town sophisticates, girls who had left the village and were on their way to becoming something else. They were well-dressed, often in skirts and heels, and their hair was dyed on subtle shades of red. They wore lots of makeup and cheap perfume. They sat stiffly, their backs not touching the seat, as if riding in a Jeep Cherokee were a formal experience. They rarely made eye contact. They were unfailingly polite, and they answered all my questions, but they were reluctant to initiate conversation. Often it took 10 minutes before a passenger inquired where I was from. This was strange, because usually it's the first order of business in a Chinese conversation. But something about the interaction changed when the foreigner sat in the driver's seat. People tried to be courteous, and they weren't sure what to make of me. Several asked if I were Chinese, which had never happened anywhere else in the country. A couple of passengers guessed that I was Uyghur, a Turkic minority from the West. One woman, after watching me battle a rutted road for 10 miles, finally said, "Are you Mongolian?" These were migrants. You've probably read in the papers about the mass movement of people from rural China to the city. When I started this journey, the figure was about 90 million. Now there's about 140 million people who have left home. It's actually more male than female in terms of numbers, but I realized that because I was traveling not during a holiday season, it's a little less common for people to go home not during the holidays. And most of these were young women who were going back to visit parents or grandparents, I think basically because they were more filial. They were more supportive of their families. And so that's why it was mostly women that I would end up picking up. And, these were people who were becoming something different, very different from what they had grown up as. And this was a couple that I picked up in Inner Mongolia. I was heading into a part of Shanxi, again, very remote area, and these two people were flagging down a ride, and, a couple who looked totally different. I pulled over, and the old guy, he had sort of a heavy accent, but I could understand. He said, "Are you going to Jingbian?" which was the next town down the road. And I said, "Yeah, I'll take you there." He said, "How much is it?" And he said, "Well, don't worry about it. It's not any money. He's like, no money? Are you sure? And I said, no. He's like, well, we can't pay more than 5 yuan. It's usually 5 yuan. I said, no, that's okay. And he had these big bags of salt from his farm. He gets in the car and I start driving, and the woman's totally silent. And the old guy says, do you know Han Helio? He'd asked me where I was from, and I said I'd driven there from Beijing. And I said, no, who? He's like, Han Helio. Do you know Han Helio? I said, no, who's that? And he's like, he's from our village. He went to Beijing. I was curious to know if you'd met him. I said, I'll keep my eye out. We talked for a while, and he said, you said you came from Beijing. And I said, yeah. And he's like, you're not Chinese, are you? After we've been talking for about 10 minutes. And I said, no, I'm not Chinese. I'm an American. I live in Beijing. He's like, I knew you weren't Chinese. And the whole time we was having this conversation, the young woman who was his granddaughter was sort of, blushing, a little bit embarrassed for him. And she was, a young girl in her teens, late teens, who had left the village and now worked in a beauty parlor. And like so many of the migrants that I picked up, she dressed up very nicely for this fairly routine journey back to where she was working, and she was carefully made up and had nice clothes. One of the few things that she said to me was, I'm never going back to the village. I'll never go back there to live. And it was common to hear people say that. And just seeing these two together reminded me of the incredible generation gap that you have in a country like this. I mean, you can just tell by their faces and their outfits. The world that this man grew up in is so different from his granddaughter. And the generations in China, there's often a lot of trouble understanding because of this generation gap. It also means that the young people, they don't have a lot of direct guidance. They have to depend very heavily on themselves. You hear this a lot from people in their teens and 20s. It's hard, their parents didn't go through the same things they did. Their experiences are totally different. Somebody like this old guy wouldn't know what it's like to be a migrant. He didn't have that experience. He hadn't been somebody who had, who had left home young. And it also makes you realize that it's basically a young person's country. Of the 1.3 billion people in China right now, more than 70% are between the ages of 16 and 64. In the working ages, more than 70%. It's the highest percentage they've ever had in modern history. So it sort of is a unique moment. And of course, that's going to change partly because of the one-child policy. When I was driving, I would pull over in small villages, and I would always ask people about the population. And almost everywhere I went, the population had dropped by at least 50%. Sometimes even more radically. If especially if you're away from a major road, people would have left even earlier. And it was quite common to stop in a place, and everybody you see is either elderly or disabled or a very small child. Because when migrants go to the cities, as of this generation, it still is uncommon for them to keep their kids at home. They still tend to marry relatively young and have children relatively quickly. But they're not comfortable raising them in these new cities where they work. It's partly because they want to have a high degree of mobility. People change jobs a lot. And it's also because they're busy. I mean, these are very demanding jobs, and the people in factories are trying to work overtime hours usually. So the kids are often sent back to their villages. And so you stop in these places and you see old people and very, very young children. When I was driving a couple of days after this, I stopped in a place, again, sort of on this border area between Shanxi and Inner Mongolia, that was called Ansi, which means Temple of Peace. And somebody had told me that there were beautiful Great Wall ruins near there. And the ruins are all across northern China, and most of them are not monitored or sort of, have entrance fees or not visited, and often the most beautiful places were like this. And I'd heard this was quite nice there. So I pulled over to ask for directions, and there was an old guy who was on crutches, and there were little kids running all around, which is sort of a typical scene that you would witness in the north. I pulled over, and he's like, oh yeah, the Great Wall, and he started telling me directions. Like a lot of people in China, is very bad at giving directions. It's a very, and again, people who haven't traveled or who haven't driven or haven't had this experience, it's not that natural of a thing. And so finally, I couldn't get it straight, and he had an accent as well. And finally he said, well, why don't you just take my grandson? He can show you the way. The kid was 12 years old. And immediately the kid opens the door and gets in the car. Before he can shut the door, 5 more kids piled in. I looked at the old man, expecting him to call the children back out, but he didn't say a word. He wore the slightly dazed expression that you find among people who have lived through war and revolution and famine, and now, in their twilight years, have been assigned the task of raising young children. And so I left the village with the children in my car. We drove west along a dirt track. Periodically, I had to plow through a patch of drifted sand. I heard the kids whispering, and then I realized that I had told the old man virtually nothing about myself. They didn't know where I was from or what I was doing. All I had asked for were directions to the ruins. I pulled over, stopped, and faced the children. I drove here from Beijing, I said. That's where I live. But I'm an American. I'm visiting a lot of areas with the Great Wall, and that's why I came here. The kids listened intently. In the front seat, there was a boy and a girl, and 3 more boys sat in the back. The oldest child was 12, and in his lap he carried a 2-year-old girl. All 6 were extremely serious, especially the baby. A look of worry creased her pudgy face. I happened to have my camera with me in the driver's seat, and when I turned to look at them, this is what I saw. You can see the incredible range of uncertainty and distrust and maybe a little bit of fear, especially the little girl at the best expression. It occurred to me that this was a situation for chocolate. I always kept a stash of Dove bars, and now I divided and distributed 3 of them, and then we headed off for the Great Wall. I felt like the Pied Piper. For all I knew, these kids represented the entire future of Temple of Peace. So we drove over, and the kids gave the directions. We got to the ruins. They all jump out of the car and come running. You can see this huge signal tower. And in places like this, the desert is encroaching, and so the desert is sort of pressing up against these old ramparts. And this is a signal tower in the foreground, about 30, 40 feet tall. Really impressive. All the kids charge off. They left me with the baby, so I'm just carrying the baby. The baby still looked pretty worried, but she's sort of gnawing on the Dove bar, and so she's going to tolerate it for the time being. And then they go to the side of the thing, and there's a hole, and it goes into a tunnel, and then you go in, and there's a shaft that goes all the way up to the top, because this was a lookout tower. And in the old days, they would have a ladder going in, but of course the ladder's long gone. And I sort of scrambled in there after them, and the boys were just shimmying up this enormous shaft, and I'm sort of like, maybe you shouldn't, but they were already up at the top. They were up at the top instantly. Came back, and there's a picture of the guys there. And 3 of them, you can see 3 of them are brothers, the 3 who are dressed sort of similarly and look alike, which is not... It's not at all uncommon in rural China to see people that have siblings, because the policy is really is enforced irregularly, and it really depends on the region and the officials. And in this case, I talked to their old grandfather, and he said, people just pay a fine. It's not that big of a deal. When we returned to Temple of Peace, the old man on crutches was waiting patiently. He still wasn't the slightest bit concerned about who I was or what I was doing. In northern villages, people were rarely suspicious, and it was standard for them to invite me in for tea or a meal. I had no illusions about the toughness of rural life, but nevertheless there was something poignant about driving through these dying villages. These were last glimpses, the end of small towns and countryside childhoods. And rural traditions of honesty and trust probably wouldn't survive the shift to city life. There aren't many parts of the world where strangers welcome without question and entrusted with children. It made me sad to drive away from Temple of Peace. In the years after this journey, because this was the beginning of this project, which ended up spanning 8 years, I often wondered about those kids and what happened. And this, I had heard so much about migration, I'd seen some of the effects, but really going through these villages was gave it a new quality for me, because you sort of tangibly see how places are changing. And that became the first third of this book. And for the second third, after taking this driving journey, I was interested in studying one of these places that's in the middle of change. And the second part of this book is about a village north of Beijing that had been losing population and had only 1 child left in the village. Everybody else who was young had moved out. And it's about the changes that happen in this village after a new road is paved. And suddenly people from the city start to come out, and they start to have contact. And a family that I write about begins to shift from farming to business. Because I really think this is sort of the story of China, is this demographic change, people leaving the countryside, and also people leaving either agricultural or traditional work unit jobs and becoming entrepreneurs or factory workers, entering the private economy. And the third section of this book, I wanted to sort of make the trajectory of this book starts in the countryside. The middle part is about a family in transition and a village in transition. And so for the third part, I wanted to study an urban area. And so I picked Zhejiang province in the southeast, which is a place that has a lot of factories and a lot of development. And then I looked for a new highway that was being built. And there was a highway being built. This is sort of south of Shanghai. There was a highway being built sort of inland there. And I just took trips along that and chose a city which was called Lishui. To basically study and observe for a couple of years and see, how do they build these cities? Because in this place they were starting an entire new factory district, which consisted of farmland in the past, and they were making it urban and making it, ready for the export economy. This was a place that was already in the midst of change. When I started there in the last 5 years, the population had gone from 160,000 to 250,000. They expected it to double in the next 15 years. Again, a very common situation in China. There are thousands of cities like this. And when you move to places like this, it's an amazing combination of these sort of sleepy villages, and then on the other parts of China, you have this incredible energy and things happening at an incredible pace. And this is sort of a common image you would see. This is a field with chalk lines across it marking a road. And sometimes you would see that sort of thing. It's the kind of place where you learn to drive very carefully. Because the roads are sort of open before the infrastructure is finished. One of the last things they put in are manhole covers. Because people have a tendency to steal them and sell them for scrap. And I was in the factory district, and this woman drove her car into one of them, and all the guys came out from the restaurant and pulled her out. It's the sort of thing where you can almost see things literally before your eyes change. And my friend Mark Leong was the photographer for this project. I did a story for National Geographic, and he did a series of pictures that looked at one where he took a fixed point and returned every month and took a photo. And for here you can see the fixed point is that lamp in the left. And this is August, October, December, and February. In 5 months, you could see places change like that. And it was very common to walk through and witness these amazingly huge things like these bridges and new things going up. It's also, people sometimes ask about access in China, which is always an interesting issue. And in the factory town, in a place like this, I repeatedly applied with the government to sort of go as an official journalist. And they always said, well, we've got the Spring Festival coming up. This isn't a good time. And then I'd apply afterwards and say, well, we just had the Spring Festival. We're really busy. They never approved it, but I would just go and show up. And I never had any trouble. And it's one of the most remarkable things is you can go to something like this. Like I would go and look at this bridge, and I just talked to some workers who were standing nearby. And before you know it, they've got me and Mark up on the top of the thing. You can really access sort of anything. People are amazingly open. These places everybody there is an outsider. And the result, and a lot of people are engaged in business, and the result is that they have to be very open. They can't sort of, be too close to people who are different or outsiders. Another effect of this that I really noticed compared to 10 years ago is people's Mandarin has improved so much. And it's not because of, the schools push Mandarin, and that has helped. But the main reason is because of migration. People need to speak it in order to survive. And so it's very actually easy now as an outsider to do reporting in these places because everybody speaks the same language that I had learned. One day we went to the tallest building in town that they were building. I think it was 30 some odd stories. And we talked to the guys, construction workers at the bottom, and they said, oh yeah, you can just go up. Just take the elevator up. Just make sure when you get to the top, there's another elevator shaft. Don't walk into that one because that one's not finished. Nobody even bothered to accompany us. You can just sort of, there's Mark taking his pictures. There's really no adult supervision in these places. I talked with one of the officials I would meet officials sort of informally through business people would give me introductions. And I met one of the guys in charge of this factory zone. And he was talking about the infrastructure. During the 5-year period, they were spending 5 times as much money that they had spent in the previous half century. This incredible change. And he talked about the new factory zone, which had been farmland before. This had previously been very rugged countryside, the sort of mountains you see in the background. And you can't build factories in places like that. And so he explained to me, he said, well, we had to get rid of 108 mountains and hills. And I said, what do you mean? How do you move 108 mountains? So he said, well, you just take the tops you take off the top and you fill in the low parts. And this was literally what they were doing. By the time we got there, they were mostly done, but they were still working. This is what they're working on a hill on one edge of the zone. And like everything else, I just showed up and started talking to people. And the day that I showed up, the guy told me, they had already moved 1.2 million cubic meters of dirt and stone, and they were planning the next project. In less than an hour, they planned to ignite another 9.9 tons of dynamite that had just been packed beneath one part of the hillside. I asked who was in charge of the demolition, and the foreman said it was a person named Mu Shio, who was standing on top of the mountain that was about to be destroyed. Can I talk to him, I asked. Sure, said the foreman. I stood there for a while. The foreman watched the caterpillar bulldozers crawling across the road. At last I said, should I just walk over there? Sure, he said. Is it okay if I go by myself? Of course. I set off alone toward the doomed mountain. Big trucks barreled down with loads of dirt and rock, and I picked my way across the rubble. Soon I began to see plastic wiring coming up from holes in the ground. And I realized that this was the area that had been packed with 9.9 tons of dynamite. I began to walk faster. Was it a bad sign that nobody else was on this stretch of hillside? Finally, I got to Mr. Mu, who was standing there with his detonator bag over his shoulder. He said, "Oh, don't worry. I've been doing this for 20 years. It's perfectly safe." And it's good to see he had the hard hat. It would have been nice if he'd offered me one. And the caterpillar bulldozers crawled away until all of them were parked in a row at the edge of the site, facing outward. They looked like big animals hunched over, their rumps turned toward the hill. The foreman blew a whistle, and everybody headed to the edge of the site, until only Mr. Mu and me were left. He finished splicing the leads and began to walk away, playing out the white wire as he went. 50 feet, 100 feet, 200. The site had grown so quiet that our footsteps crunched in the dirt. I heard birds calling up above. This was the closest thing to silence that I'd ever experienced in Lishray's development zone. We walked together to the line of caterpillars, and Mr. Mu set the detonator atop the treads. There were 2 switches, one labeled charge, the other explode. A command crackled over the radio. Charge. And Mr. Mu flipped the first switch. Get out there where you can see it better, he said. Nervously, I stepped away from the cat's shadow, looking out at the silent hillside. On the radio, a countdown began at 5 and ended with another command. Explode. Mr. Mu hit the second switch. For the briefest instant, before the mountain roared, a web of electric sparks flickered across the rocks, like lightning come to earth. That was it. Boom. So that's the third section is in this place, and I watched them preparing the factory zone, and then I also focus in on one factory, which was making this product, which you see on the screen, which when I asked the guy what it was, they described it as clothing and accessories. And I said, well, what's that for? And he said, it helps make women more beautiful. And then he held it here, and I realized it was the support for a bra. And the guy said, we make them in this size and this size, and we make some that are really big. And I said, well, some of them like this, he made this gesture with it. I said, well, those really big ones, what are those for? And he said, for Russians. And these guys this was what they had made in the past, and now they were making a new product, which are these little rings, which are the rings that bra straps go through. Which to us, again, these are very trivial products. And this is just something, I happened to meet these guys and ended up, so the third section of the book is about these guys in that development zone trying to make this business. And it's sort of, you kind of go from this image of the Great Wall to this little thing. And you realize all of this energy, all of these migrants, all of these hills and mountains being moved, so much of it is for these sort of going toward the fabrication of these products that many of us wouldn't think twice about. And these things represent an entire world for these people I wrote about. So that's sort of a basic introduction. Yeah. I left after a little more than 10 years. And it was partly, I mean, it's an incredibly invigorating, exciting place. It's also pretty wearing. It's hard on your health sometimes. The air's not good. And these trips were very rough. I would get sick a fair amount. And there's a lot of days when you're really tired, basically. It's hard. You're in this factory town. I mean, I'd spend hours in there. It might be 105 degrees outdoors, and this place is not air conditioned, and they're making these things. And, it's exhausting. It's like being a factory worker sometimes. And so I sort of felt like for health reasons it might be good to do something different, which I think was probably true. I lost about 30 pounds the moment I got back to the States because I started exercising again. But really the more important reason for me was just that as a writer, I felt like if you're too tied to one place, it might limit you in a number of ways. And I felt like I would also learn new things. And I think I've been writing about other subjects and writing about the States more recently, and I think it's been very good. I also wanted some time in the U.S. I hadn't lived in the U.S. for about 15 years, and I felt like I might be losing touch. And I think so I've been happy with that. Also, my wife Leslie is a writer as well, and we knew that we would return to China eventually, but we wanted to do different things for some period. Then we come back with sort of new skills and fresh eyes. So that was the thinking that went in, and I haven't regretted it. I've been I was very happy there, and I've been happy here. So I feel lucky. You mentioned the character in my second book, Polat, who was a Uyghur, which is an ethnic minority from the west of China, who I met in Beijing, and he ended up sort of sneaking into the U.S., getting asylum. It happened to be right before 9/11 and had sort of a rough transition. I actually just talked to him on the phone today. I'll see him tomorrow in Washington, D.C. I see him whenever I go through there. He's an American citizen now. So he got citizenship, I guess it was a little more than a year ago. So he seems happy. I mean, his English is quite solid. He he works for a car dealership. As a driver, it's a pretty solid job. He's got benefits and so on. I think he's lonely though. I think he would like to get married, and it's hard. There's not that many Uyghurs in the States, and yeah, that never worked out. She wasn't going to get into the States, and he can't go back basically. So I think that side of it has been really hard for him. For somebody in that position, I mean, it's one of these ethnic groups that they're sort of marginalized wherever they are, I feel like, when you're from a sort of obscure group like that. But there are a circle of Uyghurs around Washington, D.C., quite a few, so he has friends. There's not many women in those groups, though. Yeah, I think it helped that I didn't start writing for a couple of years. I mean, the Peace Corps was a really good introduction, basically, for me. And because of the intensity of the experience, and also because you're so deeply committed to that place and to the people, I thought very carefully about how I was going to write about it and about those people. I cared a lot about them, and I felt like by the end of that, and that first book was actually quite difficult in terms of the writing came very easily, but the editing was hard because I was thinking about these issues, about how do you, what's my responsibility as a writer? How are people going to respond to this? That was very stressful. I wasn't sure about humor, for example. I just wrote the book there was no contract, and I didn't really expect it to be published, and the humor was just naturally part of the story for me. I mean, that's how I responded to fooling, but I wasn't sure when I was looking back, and some of my readers said, I wonder if people are just going to think you're making fun of these folks, and so I thought a lot about that. But I felt like in the end that people there had a good sense of humor, and they laughed at the same stuff, and I couldn't write about it without making it funny, and I was glad I did that. And in the years since, I've always tried to use humor in these stories, and I feel like it's actually kind of a way of respecting people. If you think that they can't, that you can't talk about the jokes or the funny things that happen because they're poor or something. I think that's condescending, basically. And so, but you do, it is something I became more comfortable with over time. Also now, Chinese people read this stuff. It's very different. If you write a story in the New Yorker now, it gets translated very quickly. And the people, my students have read my book, and so I've had a sense of reactions. The people in the village have seen the stories that I wrote in the New Yorker. They were translated, so that helps. That's a really good dynamic, and there is a lot of interest there. I mean, actually, 2 of my books are now being published in the mainland for the first time, so that's something new. I had no idea what to expect. I thought I might have to take gas with me, but it turned out like the gas is all state owned in China. The gas stations, there's only a couple of companies, and they had stations set up in a very systematic way. It wasn't tied to the market, and so I was never far from a gas. It was not an issue. I didn't need to take it with me. And at that time, it was subsidized and pretty cheap. I think it was $1.20 or $1.30. I have it in the book, $1.30. I mean, now it's like almost $5 a gallon. That's changed a lot in China. There's been huge inflation in gas because of all these drivers. The price has gone up. The government's not subsidizing as much as they did. Breakdowns, I mean, things went wrong all the time, but there's always somebody who can fix things, basically. And as long as you're patient, you're not on a schedule. I think I had to get an alternator replaced in Inner Mongolia, and I remember going to the mechanic shop, and the guy was smoking the whole time he's working on the car, and you got it fixed. So, things usually work out there as long as you're patient. Yeah, that's also a good question. My parents would like to know that. My mom never visited me in China, actually, and she never really understood why I was there. I don't know why. I mean, I didn't have an interest in it when I was in college. I didn't study China. I went to college at Princeton, which to me was very sort of exotic and far away, and that was like a foreign country. And then I was in England at Oxford for a couple of years, and that was foreign too. And I guess maybe I was working my way east in retrospect, but I didn't. I wanted to be a writer. I majored in English and creative writing in college, but I wanted to learn a language. I felt like this was something that I hadn't really had an opportunity to do, and I was curious about it. And so after I was at Oxford, I took a long trip with a friend around the world. We went east, basically from Oxford, and we ended up spending 6 months traveling by land all the way from Prague down to the Gulf of Thailand, including the Trans-Siberian train. I was interested in Russia. This was in 1994. And I'd heard bad things about China, and our plan was just to get out of China once we got there, basically. Everybody said it's a pain, you can't get stuff done. And, I found Russia a little bit depressing at that time. And then we showed up in Beijing, and the place just kind of blew me away. I mean, there was a real tangible energy, and something I'd never thought about, had no interest in it. And I just realized, something's happening here. And I liked the way, even though I didn't speak the language, and I just liked the way people responded to, you could tell. I mean, if you wanted to go to a restaurant, you could just go in the back, and we used to just point at stuff, and they'd cook it up. And people, you could just tell, like, this is a place where you could probably live, and it's probably pretty interesting. And so I ended up traveling for 5 or 6 weeks on that trip, and by the end of that, I just had decided that I wanted to go back. So I applied to the Peace Corps and sort of asked to be sent to China. And so, yeah, it was sort of happenstance. The Peace Corps is an excellent way to learn Chinese. I mean, I think maybe the two best ways are the Peace Corps or being a Mormon missionary. And I only had one of those options open to me. But they, we had like an intensive training in Chengdu, about 2 months. And by the end of that, you could do basics, and you sort of had some sense of how the tones worked, which is the hard thing with Chinese. And so you could ask directions, you could buy things, and then you were on your own, and you had to find tutors. And the tutors, I wrote about this in Rivertown, the tutors hadn't met a foreigner before, and they didn't speak English, and that was a hard adjustment for all of us. And so I kind of felt like I spun my wheels a little that first 6 months. After the first 6 months, I could feel it getting better and better, and after about a year, I started to have some comfort level in terms of starting to have real conversations and beginning to read newspapers. And the second year, it really fell into place, I found. So I felt like and at the end of 2 years, I was pretty comfortable. I could talk to people on the phone and do things like that. I mean, it's still, I'm not a native speaker. I never will be. My wife grew up speaking Chinese, and her Chinese is much better than mine. But she doesn't. It's not as good as her English. So the way languages work, it's gradations, and so you're never, I think, completely fluent if you learn as an adult. But I do think it's one thing that makes it easy is that people want to talk to foreigners, as long as you're not in Beijing or Shanghai. And so that really helped. People were always coming up to me. And when I was in the Peace Corps initially, it kind of drove me nuts because I'd go to a tea house and I'd be reading something and people come over and look at it and start talking about me. And there was a short period when I was like, this is really annoying. Then I realized, you're trying to learn Chinese. Why don't you just talk to them, And it sort of like clicked, and that's what I did. I would make myself available, basically, and you had to become very comfortable in public. Was part of the piece, and it's a good experience. Being very different like that, I found to be a really good experience. Of course, it makes it hard coming back to the U.S. We always joked about that. how hard it was. You go in and, because when you're in China, there's like just a constant running dialogue. Look at the foreigner. The foreigner's buying something. He's getting a bottle. He's going to buy it. He's going to pay for it. Now he's paying for it. And you just hear this like, it's sort of like, the soundtrack to your life, and you come to the States and it just goes silent, and it's just like, look, I'm buying something here, isn't it? Is nobody interested? None of you. I mean, I wrote Rivertown and sent it to publishers in '99. And I got a number of responses where people said, this is good, it's well written, but I don't think anybody wants to read a book about China. A lot of publishers turned that book down. And it was a totally different market then. I mean, now there's just tons of books, and it is a really huge change. And it's hard for people to remember that was only 10 years ago, basically, or that in '96 when I went there, it was kind of, it wasn't like everybody's like, oh, that's a smart place to go. I felt like I was sort of, dropping off the map for a while. So it's interesting. It's good. I mean, I think it's sort of, and it's amazing all the people that are studying Chinese here in the States now, and all the people that want to learn it. I mean, I don't think Americans have ever really tried to engage with such a tough language at that level. I mean, there was a lot of Japanese in the 80s and 90s, but not as much as Chinese now. So it's great. I mean, I think it's a good thing. And for a long time, you're in China, and they were always asking about America, and you'd wonder where's the other side to this. But now we have it, So each of these books, each of the sections, these 3 sections of this book I sort of have a different relationship to the people I'm writing about. And one, I'm just driving through and often meeting people once and seeing communities once. In the 3rd section, the factory, I'm going back repeatedly, but I'm still basically a journalist relationship with them. The village was different. I didn't go there as a writing project. That wasn't what I had in mind. I went there for personal reasons, and I didn't expect to sort of develop this relationship with the people in the place. And a lot of it had to do with their son. Their son became very sick, and I became involved. My friend and I rented the house with a friend named Mimi, and we became very involved trying to get medical care. And that really changed the relationship with the family and also with the village. So yeah, those were people that it was an unusual relationship. I think the people in China that I'm closest were them, and the students I taught in Fuling, the same thing, and when you do have those bonds, it is really deep. I mean, I'm still in touch with probably about 100 of my former students. I hear from them almost every day because they're on email now. And the family in the village, I call them on the phone all the time. I'll see them next month when I go back to China, and they call periodically. Usually the little boy Wei Jia, he calls at about 6 in the morning on a Saturday or Sunday. I always say, Wei Jia, do you know what time it is? And he's like, yeah, it's 6 in the morning. He knows exactly. He just thinks I should be up and at it at that time. But yeah, I'm always aware of this because, my wife is Chinese American, and she's also a writer, and she did very deep field work in southern China in factories. And, our profiles are so different, and we ended up with different kinds of stories as a result. And she could go into the factories without people noticing her, and she sort of had very intimate relationship with these young women, and they would tell her a lot of things that I'm sure they wouldn't tell me. Also she could be less disruptive than me. The flip side to that is that there's, like talking to these business owners and sort of watching things in the factory, it might have been easier for me in another sense because I was an oddball. It was kind of interesting to them. They just found, they didn't know exactly how to place me. And also as a male, it's easier for you to hang out when they're drinking or smoking or doing the things that men do. So I always feel like there's really no ideal profile. And the key as a writer or researcher is to figure out what works and use it to your advantage, basically. And so like if I had been trying to write Leslie's book, that wouldn't have worked as well, and so that's basically it. But you do affect. I mean, and that's one reason why I feel like it's important to write in the first person, because people respond to me in certain ways as a foreigner. I can't really remove myself from the scene because sometimes, I'm changing the scene. And I don't think that doesn't ruin it. It just means that the reader should know that. There's actually a lot of girls who have been adopted from Fuling, which that wasn't happening when I lived there. That happened in the years since. And I'm going to I'd like to visit the orphanage when I go back. I mean, it is, I hear from a lot of parents, and it's sort of an amazing generation, and a lot of those girls are getting to the age now where they're studying Chinese, or they might be going to college even, and it's really going to be interesting to see, what they think of China and what sort of relationships they develop. So I went to Tibet, after I finished the Peace Corps in '98, I did a long trip in Tibet, and I had friends there and spent a lot of time. And I wrote a piece for the Atlantic Monthly, which you can find online, that was published in the beginning of '99. Haven't been back. I've been to Tibetan regions in Western Sichuan, but I have not been back to Tibet proper. As a journalist, it's really hard to get in there, and especially now. Even before the protests, it was hard, but now that's impossible. Basically, I would really love to go back sometime. And I have, I hear from I have a lot of students who work there. Actually, a lot of Sichuanese go out there. I mean, there was the kid I described in Rivertown who played Hamlet, who was a really sort of a special, charismatic kid. He's out there and was a principal for a school for years. I visited him in '98, but now he's moved on he's actually works for a propaganda bureau. And I'd be fascinated to spend some time with him. And someday I'd like to see him, but I mean, it's not possible now. It's funny. It's a place where Sichuanese go out there. There's another kid I just heard about recently, kind of a classic Sichuan. This kid he was a nice kid, not one of my better students. And he was teaching in a middle school, and he got in trouble somehow because he disciplined a student. I think he beat the student basically for doing poorly on exams, which happens in really bad parts of Sichuan. But he got disciplined and suspended for a year. And so he takes his year off and starts driving a cab. And then after the year's up, they say, okay, you can come back and take your teaching job. He's like, I think I want to keep driving a cab. And then he keeps going west, and he ends up in Qinghai, which is right next to Tibet on the Tibetan plateau. And he's set up, and apparently now he has some huge cab empire out there. Owns like 20. He's like the most successful student that I have, basically, in terms of he's a millionaire, and there's all these stories of legends about him, and it's all because, he got in trouble for beating some poor kid. That's kind of a classic Sichuan story for this generation. I mean, so someday I'm going to go back and sort of track down all of these people. That'll be a project in the distant future, though, because I'll write about other things now. Yeah, no, thanks so much for coming.